All right. So if everyone can hear me okay, I think we'll get started. It's 2:31 now, and I think I have everyone outside the waiting room. So we'll jump into today's session. So hi, everyone, and welcome back to CNSC's live broadcast for the Science Literacy Week. This is the second session of our two sessions focusing on biodiversity in Churchill. So for those that are just joining for the first time today, I'm Erica, and I'm the research manager here at the Churchill Northern Study Center. And I'll be hosting today's event. I'm also joined by Jesse, who is an intern, and he'll be our tech guy for the session. So if anyone has any questions they want to put in the chat, he'll be monitoring that. So as I mentioned, this is the second of two broadcasts. Yesterday we talked to Dr. Jim Roth about boreal biodiversity, and today we are going to be shifting focus to the tundra environment. So just to outline what today's going to look like for those that are new, this session will have a quick introduction and then a short presentation by our special guest. And then that will be followed by a quick Q&A session. So the whole thing will take about a half hour. And as I mentioned, Jesse will be monitoring the chat for the Q&A session. So just post any questions you have in there and we'll get to them during that portion of the event. So I'd also like to cover a few housekeeping items before we jump into things here. So firstly, this session will be recorded and made available on the CNSC social media after the fact. We'll also be encouraging people to use the side-by-side feature in Zoom so that they can see the screen sharing as well as the presenter at the same time. And you can find that up in the top right corner of your screen, or maybe it's over here, the three little dots, or on some computers, it's under viewing options, and just click the side-by-side. Great. So if that works for everyone, we'll jump into a quick introduction. So for those that joined yesterday, we now know that Churchill is very unique in the sense that it lies on the intersection of both the boreal and tundra ecosystems. So we're focusing on both of those environments and particularly the transition zone between them. So the point of the series is to highlight both of those ecosystems as well as the amazing researchers that actually study them. So without further ado, I'll introduce our special guest today, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba, Sean Johnson-Bice, who's joining us from Winnipeg. So Sean actually was just up here earlier this month conducting his research. And he previously has a master's degree from the University of Minnesota, where his research focused on beavers, actually, spatial dynamics and population ecology of beavers. And now his research in the subarctic is focusing on foxes, both red fox and Arctic fox, and their food web dynamics here in Churchill, and particularly in these really unique ecosystems. So with that, I will hand it over to Sean for his presentation. Take it away, Sean.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica. Let me try and share my screen here. Okay. Drop this down. Okay. So as Erica mentioned, today I'm going to be talking primarily about the Arctic tundra and a little bit about the biodiversity that we see on the tundra. My focus is going to be primarily in and around the Churchill area, and I'm also going to use the Arctic foxes and red foxes as kind of a case study, because they do represent a nice case study to understand current biodiversity patterns on the tundra, and then also how these patterns might be changing under climate change. So first I'm going to be talking about what does the Arctic tundra mean? So there are a couple of different definitions. One of them that people often think of is they often think of the Arctic Circle. And so the Arctic Circle is basically where the point on the Earth that the sun is visible for at least 24 hours, at least once during the year. That's kind of this blue circle here on the map. More commonly, though, the tundra is primarily what we would define as land without trees, so basically north of the tree line. And I'm going to stick to that second definition there because, as Erica mentioned, we do have some Arctic tundra in and around Manitoba. So I put a little red box here of where we have some tundra in Manitoba. And so some of the characteristics that we see in tundra ecosystems is that we have a lot of high temperature seasonality. So that would be extreme cold in the winter times, as well as some relatively warm temperatures during the summer. Tundra environments are characterized by having low plant productivity. They're also characterized in relation to both of those things with low nutrient availability. And so as a consequence of these three major characteristics, seasonality, low productivity, and low nutrient availability, the tundra has quite low biodiversity. In fact, we can kind of see that these trends exist throughout the globe. So as just a general rule of thumb, biodiversity decreases with increasing latitude. So we can see here on this kind of heat map, biodiversity is going to be highest in and around the equator. And then as we get farther away from the equator up towards the tundra, we see that biodiversity does decrease quite a bit. So, what are some of the ecological consequences of this low biodiversity? And I'm going to be focusing primarily on the effects that it has on vertebrate populations. So, one of the things that is a consequence of low biodiversity is that we get a lot of unstable population dynamics in our vertebrate species. And so we also get these population cycles. So if you think of, for example, like snowshoe hares down in boreal forest, but then up on the tundra, a lot of the food web is really centered around these rodents, brown like lemmings and voles primarily. And so here's a graph of, we can see these populations that exhibit these really large fluctuations, generally anywhere between 3 and 5 years. So we can see as a consequence as well, we also have relatively simple food web structure with very few vertebrate linkages. So in the Churchill area, the Arctic fox food web here really only has a few linkages. So foxes primarily rely on seals in the wintertime. They'll also rely on geese during the summer, and then lemmings are available to them year round. So these three prey have primarily been the historical main foods of Arctic foxes. So not too many linkages there. The other thing that we also see is that on the tundra, we get these, like I mentioned before, the food web is dominated by these 3 to 4 year rodent population cycles, and the predator populations will track these rodent cycles. So this is a graph of the per capita Arctic fox harvest in Manitoba. And so we can see that there is this really definite cycles present within the harvest there. So as a consequence of the lemming cycles, these predators that rely on them for food, their populations do exhibit, again, these big cycles and populations. And so one of the other consequences, though, of having low biodiversity is that there is also less species redundancy within Arctic tundra environments. And when there's less species redundancy, that means that we have, generally speaking, less ecosystem resilience. And so as a result of that, Arctic ecosystems are in general less resilient, and therefore less resilient to both disturbance and species loss. And so that's not exactly some good characteristics we want to have during some of the periods that we have here with climate change. So the Arctic is disproportionately affected by climate change. So that's kind of what this graph is showing you here, is that this is the relative temperature change over the last 50 years. So you can see up here in the Arctic, it is warming at a faster rate than pretty much anywhere else on the planet. So when you get these big changes like that, in a system that is less resilient, we do see a lot of effects happening in the tundra. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about here, is what are some of these consequences of climate change for the tundra food webs. So the first one with the food web dynamics is we have the rodent populations that exhibit these cycles. These cycles have essentially begun to collapse over the past several decades. So it's happening not only in our study area in Churchill, but also up in the high Arctic of Canada, in Greenland, and really throughout the entire circumpolar distribution. As a consequence of climate change as well, the sea ice has been declining through time. In the news just this week, they've kind of come out with and saying that this is essentially right now there's the second least amount of sea ice in September since we've been keeping records of it. And so as a consequence of, for foxes, as a consequence of the reductions in sea ice, that means that they have reduced access to those important seal resources during the wintertime. And then another thing that we see with climate change in the Arctic tundra is that we get the northward expansion of boreal species. So species like red foxes here, who are a major competitor with Arctic foxes where they overlap, are now moving up onto the tundra. And so we see some negative consequences as a result of that as well. And so altogether, when we put those changes together, this indicates that in Manitoba, we've been seeing a long-term population decline in Arctic foxes. So this is one of the things that I'm primarily working on for my thesis, is trying to describe this long-term population decline and maybe what are some of the drivers of it. And it's probably all of the above: changes in rodent populations, reduced access to sea ice, as well as competition with red foxes. So if we go back to this traditional food web that has historically existed in and around Churchill, with just a few vertebrate linkages, as we move forward with climate change and as it sort of changes the food webs in and around Churchill, this is kind of what the new food web is looking like in our area. So we've got red foxes moving up onto the tundra, as well as down here in the bottom left corner is a meadow vole, and they are traditionally a boreal species as well. And so now this is what our research is really trying to understand a little bit better in and around Churchill, is how has these food web linkages changed through time? What effect does climate change have on each of these different species and on each of these interactions between them? And then ideally, we'd like to understand perhaps what is going to happen in the future. How are these food web interactions maybe going to change going forward? And so that's kind of what we are interested in understanding for the long term. So if I had a few take-home messages for everybody, it would be the first one is the Arctic tundra is changing and from top to bottom. And in our area, Churchill is a great area to study the effects of these changes in climate change. As Erica mentioned in the beginning, we are really at that transition zone between the boreal forest and tundra. So we are seeing a lot of these changes happening right in our own study area. And lastly is a lot of this information that we've gathered over the years is really a consequence of the long-term monitoring that both we do and that the CNSC and all the partners at the CNSC do as well. Without this long-term monitoring, we just wouldn't be able to understand and kind of untangle the different processes that are undergoing in the tundra. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. If you guys have any questions for me, my email here is down at the bottom, or perhaps you can email Erica or contact Erica for more information. And yeah, with that, I guess I will take some questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. That was awesome. We definitely have lots of questions that were sent in beforehand. So we'll try to get through most of those, but if not, I can forward along your email and you can tackle those at a later time. So for going back to some of the questions that we had sent in before the session, I'll start off with an easy one. What is your favorite tundra species? And I'm going to say that you can't say Arctic fox or a red fox. Maybe let's go non-vertebrates and why?
Non-vertebrate species. That is a great question. I don't know if I have a real answer to that. I mean, I do like some of the vegetation we have up there. So when I'm out in the field, certainly some of the different mosses are really fun to see. And yeah, we'll go with that.
Cool. Our new executive director at the center is a moss expert, so she'll be happy to hear that.
Perfect.
And another easy one to throw at you is what got you interested in studying the tundra taiga ecosystem?
So I think for me is just when I was younger, I just always was kind of interested by the tundra ecosystem. The fact that there are very few species up there, and it is a relatively simple system, but it offers a lot of really, because of its relatively simple system and few, for example, food web links, it offers a lot of good opportunities to study a lot of these ecological principles in place. And I just, when the opportunity presented itself to potentially get up onto the tundra, and once I started doing research on the Churchill area and all that you could see up there, I think that was a fun thing as well, that you can actually go up and see wildlife all the time. That was pretty appealing to me. So prior to this, when I was working in northern Minnesota, working in the really dense forests there, you can't actually see anything. So everywhere I'd go, I'd be following animals around in the woods, but I would never really see them. Whereas on the tundra, it's really nice to be able to have that visibility and feel like you're more connecting with nature and animals in that way.
Cool. Yeah, that actually leads me to another question that one of our technicians had for you is, because the tundra is so expansive, is it harder to find your study species? But you said that it actually is in fact easier because of the lack of vegetation.
Yes, and that's a great question. So when we monitor these Arctic foxes, we monitor their dens out on the tundra. And so these dens, basically, they'll reuse them for decades or centuries, even, we think. And through that repeated use of these dens, they will secrete, urine and feces and other prey items in and around the dens. And so that increases the amount of nutrients on these dens. And so as a result, these Arctic fox dens become essentially these lush gardens out on the tundra. And so if we're looking to figure out where are our species, Arctic foxes are pretty much the easiest ones you can find out there, because you can see their dens from the air, basically. In fact, if you look at some of the aerial imagery, you can even see these Arctic fox dens on aerial imagery because of that really lush vegetation. So that is kind of funny. They occur at a lower density, obviously, than in other places, but we can find them pretty easily.
Awesome. So we have a question from Malachi, who actually joined us yesterday as well, and he had a great question for Jim. So another great question for you, Sean, is red foxes and Arctic foxes are very similar species. So why do red foxes, feed on Arctic foxes?
That's a good question. So red foxes are bigger than Arctic foxes. They're about a third bigger on average. And so just simply as a consequence of their body size, they can really push Arctic foxes off of carcasses. They can exclude them from dens if they're competing for den resources. And so we don't actually know whether red foxes we don't know that they consume Arctic foxes as a regular source of prey. It's more likely that they kill them to reduce competition. So if you're both competing for the same food resources, and your neighbor over there is smaller than you, it might benefit you to go over and kill him and or its offspring.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. So going back to kind of some of the climate change related things that you talked about through your presentation. So you mentioned a few ways how Arctic species might be affected, particularly those with unstable population dynamics. So a question that was sent in was, how will something like climate change affect tundra species that rely on changing seasons and changing the color of their coats, like Arctic fox, like the ptarmigan? How might changing seasons affect their success?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we haven't seen too much of that, as far as I'm aware, on the tundra, but certainly in the boreal forest, there's been quite a bit of research done in the boreal forest looking at like snowshoe hares in particular, and how they have changed their coats or lack thereof in relation to climate change. And so what you get is what we call a phenological mismatch. So basically, if the temperatures if either winter is getting onset too early or too late, and the timing of their molting is changing, then you get this sort of mismatch. So whether they're using the molt for warmth, like Arctic foxes do, or if you're a hare, whether you're using that molt for primarily camouflage. If you get any sort of that mismatch, you might get consequences for your thermal regulation, or if you're a hare, you might be more susceptible to predation in that sense. So I I'm not entirely sure how much is known about this currently on the tundra. So that is a great question, but generally speaking, those are the patterns that we might expect if we do see some of that mismatch with molting and such.
Right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see in the future how that might affect them. So another question actually from Jesse is, could you explain a little bit more the Arctic fox harvest data and where that is actually coming from?
Sure, absolutely. So the Arctic fox harvest data it comes from the province of Manitoba. So Arctic foxes are harvested by trappers throughout the entire province, primarily up in and around the tundra, but during some peak rodent years, we do get Arctic foxes being harvested farther south. And so these numbers are basically reported back to the province. And so there is just a database essentially that we have these fur bearer statistics. So a lot of my research in my dissertation is focused on using these historical harvest statistics to understand population changes in both Arctic and red foxes.
Awesome. Yeah. I know we collect a lot of that for you guys. So
Yeah,
nice to see
yeah,
the
yeah.
graph
Those are great.
actually come to
Yeah, so
fruition.
a lot of the animals do come from in that we use. We do come from around the Churchill area, and yes, we do have a pretty good relationship with some of the trappers up there.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to go to one of my questions I have for you. Um, so again, we talked a lot about climate change and how tundra species might be affected. So you also mentioned that other southern species are seeing success by moving north, such as the red fox. What about some other species, other than the foxes, moving into this very harsh environment that we have here in the tundra? Is it worth it for them to move further north? Will they survive in these harsher conditions?
I think it depends on. I think it depends. I think is probably the short answer to that. For some of them, with range expansion, many species who are on the boundaries, they often exhibit like worse population characteristics. So they might have shorter lifespans, have worse body condition, be essentially overall lower fitness right on the boundary edges there. But they might be getting pushed northward simply because of competition, that they run out of space to compete in the south. And so then the next closest place is in the north. And so one of the changes with climate change going forward is that on the tundra, which is areas where the harsh environmental conditions did previously limit these species from establishing, then these same limitations may no longer impose a threat or impose like a limitation on them.
Right. Great. So I think we have about 5 minutes left. So I have two more questions for you.
Right.
The first one is how does the tundra and its biodiversity actually vary from place to place? So obviously here, it's quite different in the transition zone. But how does tundra vary? The tundra we have here in Churchill compared to the higher Arctic, compared to, say, the Russian Arctic. How does it vary from place to place?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of similarities. I mean, there are obviously several differences, especially between here and the high Arctic, but a lot of particularly, for example, a lot of the main vertebrate species are pretty common throughout. So even though biodiversity in general is lower as you get towards the northern latitudes, the actual range boundaries of species actually is generally increased. And so as a consequence, you get primarily a lot of these widespread common species. So for example, in all of North America, we have a couple lemming species, and in all of kind of Eurasia, you have a couple lemming species as well that really encompass that whole northern population there,
Right.
or the whole northern range there.
Right. Okay, so I have a question from Alex DeVries, and it's a big one. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, we don't go over time. But what do you tell people who believe that climate change is part of the Earth's natural cycle?
That is a great question. what I tell people is to trust the scientists. So I don't study climate change. What I study the impacts of climate change perhaps on species. So I'm not, my research is not focused on going out there and taking the temperature data. I'm not the one who's looking at how currents are changing as a result of increased temperature or decreasing polar caps, et cetera, et cetera. But I put faith in the scientists who do study that, scientists who have dedicated their lives to that. And so what I would say to people is trust what the science is telling you, trust what the scientists say in general. And for those who maybe disagree with that, I think that what they would essentially be disagreeing with scientists. And I know that there's a lot of thought out there that we are, for example, perhaps biased in some way, shape, or form. But I don't see that really. I just see a lot of really hardworking, dedicated people who are putting together pieces of the puzzle, and that's what we're seeing. So I would say that to just overall, yeah, trust the scientists, trust what they're saying, because I do. So yeah.
Right. That's a really good point to end on. Awesome. Well, if no one has any more questions, I think we'll wrap up today's session. And thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. And thank you for everyone that joined us virtually for both of these events. I've seen a lot of really familiar names, including ex-study center staff and some locals. So it's awesome to see so many people turned out. And if you're interested in similar broadcasts to these, we would love to have you. We really miss having people here in the building and here in Churchill. So, let me know. You can reach me at research@churchillscience.ca. So I can answer as many questions as I can, or I'll forward them to Sean or Jim. And hopefully we'll see you guys in Churchill soon, or at least see you virtually again shortly. So thanks so much, everyone. And thank you again, Sean, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.